the center. Can you hear me? That is the first question. Right down the end. You can hear me, so this is working. Well, thank you so much for turning out in such numbers for what we think is a terribly important understood issue. The first point I have to make is a sad one, that Barbara Bodine cannot be with us today because she had a death in the family literally late last night, and has had to postpone a trip to the center. But we have two excellent speakers. Dan Byman, who is a senior fellow at Brookings Institution in the Center for Middle East Policy, where he's done an enormous amount of highly original work on counterterrorism and Mideast security. He's also, in real life, the Dean for Undergraduate Affairs at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And in his previous incarnations, he was a staff member for the 9/11 Commission, so has a very from a background in the Foreign Service, where he was present for 41 years and was appointed as ambassador to Yemen by President Obama from 2010 to 2013. So he has, I think, real world experience of that place, and his focus will be I think less on the war and more on the politics and this humanitarian catastrophe which is unfolding, aided and abetted by one of the themes that we stressed in this monograph, which you can take a copy of outside, on water crises around the world. We had a chapter devoted entirely to Yemen. Yemen is literally running out of water, and in the middle of a civil war, that's not one of the best things to have happen to you. So I've asked them each to speak for about 15 minutes, and I'm certain, given the quality of the audience, there will be lots of questions and comments. When you ask a question or make a comment, please identify yourself and wait for the mic to come to you, and then everyone can hear you. So without any further ado, Dan, why don't you start with the grisly details of the war?
So let me start by, first of all, thanking the Center for National Interest, thanking Jeff, thanking everyone here for coming. I'm very much looking forward to the dialogue part of this. Just looking around the room and seeing a number of familiar faces who have tremendous expertise on this part of the world. There should be a caveat before anyone talks about Yemen, which is the incredible problems we have with data. And so very basic questions, such as roughly how many people have died in the war, are not known really within any certainty margin of error. Right? I think a reasonable estimate from combat is 50 to 75,000, but that could be off dramatically in multiple directions. So that alone tells you some of the problems Yemen has, which is that there isn't an international presence, there isn't, whether it's journalistic, whether it's aid worker, whether it's government, in much of the country that is able to give us a sense of much of the details. So a lot of what we have are estimates or impressions or anecdotes that shape our thinking. When we talk about the war, it's worth pointing out that the civil war that you could argue it began 15 years ago, you could argue it began in earnest 5 years ago. There are different ways to date it, but really there are multiple civil wars going on simultaneously. And so you have these conflicts, and you have, if you will, the regime, which is recognized by several dozen people around the world, but quite importantly, several dozen people in capitals. The kind of Houthi regime that has almost no loyalty among most Yemenis, but does have international recognition to some degree. It's quite weak. You have what we're calling the Houthis, which have a strong presence in much of the country, especially in most of the northern populated areas, and are, if you will, the most dominant of the factions, but still one faction among many. You have old regime elements that have linkages to the recently deceased leader Ali Abdullah Saleh, often with military units that have kind of effectively formed their own bands or warlords. You have those linked to the Islah Party and the Muslim Brotherhood. There is a whole southern Yemeni contingent, but that itself is actually divided into different factions with different goals. You have Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. You have an Islamic State spin-off. But what I would stress about all of these is the fluidity of these factions, that in some cases they're more solid than others, especially the Houthis, which have both some authoritarian capacity and a bit more cohesion, but there's a lot of back and forth among the different factions. There are a lot of divisions within. So you have a lot of jostling over patronage, a lot of jostling over territory, and basic control issues. On top of this incredibly difficult, bloody local struggle, you have a regional power war. And I'll spend some time on this. Let's begin with Saudi Arabia. When I first began analyzing Yemen many years ago, someone once described Yemen to Saudi Arabia as comparable to what Cuba is to the United States, where there's no rational reason the United States should have cared so much about Cuba, but it did. And over a while, it just got under America's skin and assumed an importance well beyond its strategic importance. And that I can list the reasons Yemen does matter to Saudi Arabia and why that's true, but what I would say is that its importance has often been outsized in the imagination of Saudi leaders. So they've often felt that this is their legitimate backyard, and they exaggerated some of the threats that have emanated from there, but also believe that they should play a role. When they began their military intervention in 2015, they proclaimed it would be over in a week. And that was, for anyone who's known anything about the Saudi military, that was a fantasy at the time. And the fact that they're still involved 3.5 years later is no surprise. And much of what why they intervened were driven by their fears of Iran. They saw Iran as ascendant in the region, whether it was in Syria, whether it was in Lebanon, whether it was in Iraq, and they were afraid of what they would call another Hezbollah division on their border. And so they were concerned in trying to push that back. There were artillery attacks along the Saudi-Yemen border, ballistic missile attacks emanating again from the Houthis, who the Saudis in particular saw as aligned with Iran. And the Saudi response has been almost entirely bombing, right? And they're also doing a blockade. So it's been somewhat remote. There was one study, I wouldn't put too much credence into it, but it said there have been about 18,000 bombing sorties since the war began, since the Saudi war began, and about a third of those on non-military targets. I would say, from my sense of the bombing, that seems like a reasonable rough guess. Needless to say, this is very low risk to Saudi personnel, so it makes the war more sustainable than it might otherwise be. The blockade, both naval and air, has ostensibly been to stop Iranian weapons. I would stress two things about the Saudi effort. One is the Saudis, for the most part, are incredibly bad at war. So their ability to target effectively, their ability to run a blockade with some discrimination, their ability to use intelligence effectively has all historically been quite limited. And we've seen very little indication in the Yemen war that it's gotten better. Right? Despite 3 years of doing this, I don't think they're significantly better than they were when this war began. I would also stress that this is very much the war of the current Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and the de facto leader, Mohammed bin Salman. Even before he consolidated power, this was a conflict that he embraced and put his name on. And a number of other Saudi leaders who were, at the time, more influential, had the opportunity to embrace it and did not. So politically, he jumped on this, and the reason I'm stressing that is if Saudi Arabia is to withdraw, it's a political blow to the Crown Prince, right? So his prestige is vested in this war, for better or for worse. Saudi Arabia, of course, is joined by the United Arab Emirates. With all the attention given Saudi Arabia after the Khashoggi killing in particular, the UAE gets a remarkable free pass on what's going on. They've been incredibly active. They themselves are driven not only by their concerns about Iran, but also by their fears of the Muslim Brotherhood, which they've been pushing back against throughout the region. And unlike the Saudis, who are supportive of the notional Houthi government, the UAE has been more willing to work with a range of southern forces, including ones opposed to one another. But they are much more heavily involved on the ground, often either through mercenaries or relying on the forces of states such as those from the Horn of Africa that they've effectively bought. And they've taken some losses. The actual Emiratis have died in this war. But they're much better at fighting than the Saudis. It's a much smaller force. It's a more elite force. But they've been deeply involved. They've also taken the lead on a lot of the efforts against the Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula types. It's been an odd mix. So some of it's been military targeting. Some of it has been bribing them to join UAE-backed forces to fight against the Houthis, among others. So it's not an ineffective way of doing it, but it's not necessarily the way the United States would want them to do. Iran as the third major outside player. When the Saudis intervened in 2015, Iran was working with the Houthis, but not too much. It was a relatively limited relationship. The amount of weaponry going back and forth was small. The amount of Iranian influence was small. As the Saudi and UAE war escalated, the Iranian role did too. And it's still not comparable to what the Saudis and UAE are putting in on one side, but things like ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, training, technology for explosively formed penetrators, significant aid has gone there, right? It's a real thing. In my view, this is somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy on the side of Saudi Arabia rather than something that they were effectively countering, but it's quite real. This war is almost an Iranian dream. Right? They have the ability to fight to the last Yemeni, right? So they can happily have this war continue and escalate to really no cost. And the world, even the United States, points the blame at Saudi Arabia. Right? So if you talk about human cost and if you talk about financial cost, the Saudis are pouring billions in, while the Iranians are pouring millions in. And then if you talk about reputational cost, it's much more on the Saudi side than the Iranian side. Very briefly on the Houthis, it's important to note that they're relatively effective fighters. They've had given their numbers, they've been both able to conquer much of the country before the Saudi and UAE intervention, and then hold on to territory in the face of a range of different opponents fairly effectively. They're outgunned in many cases. The UAE brought Abrams tanks to some of the battlefields, right? And in Yemen, you're not going to stop one of those unless it runs out of gas, right? I mean, that's not going to happen. But nevertheless, the Houthis have, certainly held on in the face of tremendous Saudi pressure, and in some ways consolidated their power. We should have no illusions, as I and others criticize the Saudis and the UAE. The Houthis are quite brutal. They're relatively authoritarian in areas they rule. They torture, human rights abuses in general are common. But they control much of Yemen's population, and they've done so effectively. I would say that although they're tied to the Iranians, they're certainly not Iranian puppets, and they've shown a fair degree of independence. On the terrorism side, you've had a long-standing jihadist presence in Yemen, and this has gone through different iterations as different terrorist groups have risen and fallen, and sometimes there have been ties to transnational groups, sometimes it's been much more local. And when chaos really began to engulf the country in 2014, we saw a very dramatic expansion of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. For a while, they controlled significant territory around Mukalla. The Saudi blockade really helped them because they controlled a port that wasn't fully blockaded, and a lot of the goods going in and out of the country went through this group. As I mentioned, the UAE effort has pushed them back effectively, and also the UAE success in bribing a lot of their soldiers. There's one bit of bad news that I want to stress. The governance provided by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was actually reasonably high quality by Yemeni standards. And so in terms of a basic question of competence, was garbage picked up? Was justice administered? The answer was the jihadists did not do a bad job. So when people are watching warlords return to territory, when they're watching kind of, whether it's chaos or crime or violence return, some will look back on the jihadist brief reign in their land as a relatively good time compared to what came after. The U.S. war. I mentioned Saudi Arabia's difficulty in waging war. The United States has been vital in sustaining this. Part of it is simply the spare parts for Saudi's the Saudi Air Force. It's been air-to-air refueling, providing an array of intelligence. There's been a steady flow of munitions to the kingdom as well. And basically, there's a real question on whether Saudi Arabia could sustain the war tomorrow without U.S. help. Right? I mean, there is a very decisive U.S. role, as I think most people in this room know. Air forces in general are very difficult to sustain, require a lot of technical capacity, and the Saudis largely lack it. And the way the U.S. has structured its assistance programs with Saudi Arabia compared with UAE has accentuated that, where a lot of it's outsourced, either to the United States or effectively to U.S. contractors, whom the United States has considerable influence over. The United States is also doing its own direct strikes. In 2017, there were the U.S. claimed about 120 air raids on Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or Islamic State forces in Yemen. There have also been Special Operations Force raids, although, to be honest, I have no idea what the scale of those is, other than a few press leaks here or there. And the United States is also helping the kingdom, defending it with, defending against ballistic missile strikes, helping the kingdom in terms of some of the targeting of ballistic missiles in Yemen itself. So there's an array of U.S. support that is considerable and necessary. Less true for the UAE effort. Right? Again, the UAE is more involved on the ground, is more functional in general as a military, and its effort is less dependent on air power. So the UAE effort is more sustainable. A few brief notes before I hand it over to the ambassador. If the Saudis and the UAE were to withdraw, this would be an Iranian victory. I can live with that. But it's worth pointing out this is an Iranian victory. The current administration is very concerned about the growth of Iran in the region and a sense that Iran is ascendant. And this would play into that. But I think even more importantly, the Yemen war would continue. Right? So you might remove some of the fuel, you might remove some of the damage by reducing some of the international role, but it's certainly not going to end the war. Right? You're going to have a lot of the regional problems that developed in the past are now made worse by even greater resource scarcity. Even if we saw the Saudis and the UAE withdraw, there's still going to be aiding combatants in different ways. There's still going to be a lot of low-level support, more covert, more forms of assistance. But the bigger thing is there's no clear government in Yemen to take over. Right? You're in some areas, such as the Houthi areas, you have a bit more coherence. In other areas, you have to go, region by region to decide who's going to be in charge. And the infrastructure was, for those of you who've been to Yemen, it's, in its heyday was bad, right? And now has been through neglect and especially through warfare, is tremendously destroyed. And the other humanitarian catastrophe that is not even looming, that is ongoing, is not going to go away again should the bombing stop tomorrow. Even if goods go to the ports again, even if we are able to send significant supplies, you still have to distribute it. And that's going to be a tremendous challenge in Yemen, given the infrastructure there and given the ongoing civil war.
Well, thank you very much for that comprehensive, rather depressing litany of events going on and likely to continue in Yemen. And now I turn to Ambassador Feierstein for a more political take and some discussion, I hope, of this humanitarian mess we are seeing.
Right. Thank you, and thanks to the Center for hosting us, and thanks to Daniel for his comments. most of which I agree with, but I'll take issue with a few of his things a little bit later on. But let me start with where we are right now in Stockholm with the ongoing talks between the Houthis and the government. And remember that this is a follow-up to a failed effort by Martin Griffiths in September, where the Houthis at the last minute declined to come to Geneva for the talks. Martin worked hard. He addressed some of the issues that the Houthis had claimed was the reason that they weren't willing to come, and managed to get everybody to Stockholm. And so that's a positive development. And the second positive development, of course, is that as the talks were originally laid out, and remember that Martin was careful to say that these weren't negotiations, it was a consultation. He really tried to keep the level of expectations pretty low, and I think that was smart on his part in terms of what could be accomplished. But even in terms of the consultations, there was no anticipation that there would be direct contacts across the table, that they were going to be indirect, with Martin basically shuttling back and forth between separate conference rooms. So the fact that the two sides did agree after several days to actually sit in the same room and talk to one another directly is, again, a positive development. So I think that in terms of again, the low bar that Martin had set of what he was going to try to accomplish in this round of talks, which were basically confidence-building measures, particularly a prisoner exchange, which seemed to be more or less agreed even before the parties got to Stockholm, along with hopefully an agreement on reopening the Sana'a airport, and also, best case scenario, maybe even an agreement on the port of Hodeidah in order to prevent the conflict from spreading, perhaps destroying the port infrastructure, and in the worst scenario, perhaps spreading into the city and inflicting high levels of civilian casualties. There's still several 100,000 people who are living in Hodeidah. So those things are still on the table. The expectation is that the talks are going to wrap up maybe tomorrow. Antonio Guterres is in Stockholm, another positive sign. He's going to be joining the talks today. So if we come out with an agreement on those things, or some portion of those things, along with an agreement also to reconvene perhaps early in 2019, I think that Martin Griffiths should be in a position to say that he has accomplished the first phase of what his goals are. I think though that we should keep the level of expectation relatively low about how much, even under the best of circumstances, how much we're going to be able to accomplish through this UN negotiating process. And again, I think that in terms of this phase of the negotiations, we should really be focused on trying to accomplish three basic, distinct but interlinked agreements. One is a ceasefire. And I think that until you have a ceasefire, you're not going to be able to address any of the other issues. And a ceasefire, understand, and I think that Daniel is absolutely right on this, that a ceasefire is not going to end the fighting in Yemen. You are going to continue to have instability, you're going to continue to have conflict in Yemen for some time to come. This conflict that began in 2014 has spawned a number of sub fights in various places in Taz and elsewhere in the country that are not going to be resolved, even if the Houthis and the government agree that in terms of their direct fight, they're going to stand down. But the important thing is that the major elements, the bombs that are falling on people's heads, the shelling, the other major elements of fighting that have raged in the country for these last 3 or more years would stop. And that would allow you to do the other 2 things that I think are quite urgent, where I believe that the UN can play a role. One is the humanitarian aspect, and we do want to talk about that. The need to address the crisis that is confronting Yemen, and there are 2 aspects to that. One, of course, is the supply aspect, and again, it's not only the role of the international NGOs, the UN, or the other major aid donors who are going to address this, because the entire international community in and of itself cannot provide for all of Yemen's needs. The country is dependent also on the operations of the private sector, of private importers, for the vast majority of its food, of its medicine, of all of its necessities, of fuel, and therefore, even if you have a commitment from the international humanitarian world, that in and of itself is going to be an important component, but it is not by any means sufficient to address the humanitarian crisis. The other side of this is a demand side, and the fact of the matter is that it is not correct to assert that there isn't food available in Yemen, that there isn't medicine available in Yemen. In fact, people who've had an opportunity to go into the supermarkets in Sana'a or the other major cities will say that the shelves are fully stocked, that in fact there's even perishables that are getting into the country, fresh fruits and vegetables that are coming across from Oman, from Saudi Arabia, from elsewhere. So the issue isn't a lack of supply only. The other part of the problem is, of course, that the economy has collapsed. You've got a situation where the government, which is responsible for paying about 25% of Yemenis, either through civil service salaries or through aid mechanisms like the Social Fund for Welfare, that payment has not been made for a couple of years or even longer. And the other part of it, of course, is that the private economy has collapsed. So those Yemenis who are dependent on jobs in the private sector have also been unemployed and have also been unable to provide for themselves or their families for these last couple of years. So there are 2 components, again, that you need to address immediately after there's a ceasefire. One is to get the import mechanisms, both humanitarian aid mechanisms as well as private import mechanisms, working again. And then the other part of it is that you need to get enough economic activity going, including addressing the issue of the central bank, of the currency rates, and the other things that would allow businesses to begin to function again, in order to put some money in people's pockets so they can go out into the market and buy what's available. All of those things have to happen, and all of those things are urgent and can hopefully be addressed through this United Nations negotiating process. The other part of it, of course, is that what you would like to see at the end of this process is an agreement to allow the parties to go back to Sana'a. And to reestablish in some format or another some form of governance that is going to be able to take on at least the fundamental requirements of government, which would be to provide for the basic needs of their population, health, education, get those things working again. One of the things, I mean, we talked about the Houthis. One of the things, what we hear from friends who are still in Sana'a, are the changes that they're making in the educational curriculum, changes that we should be very concerned about, and many other places where education has completely stopped. Same thing with the provision of health to the majority of the population. And also, of course, ultimately, what you'd like to see is the ability of the government, in whatever form it is, to begin to reestablish law and order in other parts of the country, so that you can begin to address some of these other factional issues and factional fights that are going on in many places. But beyond that, I think that at least at this phase, we have reached about as far as we're going to reach in terms of helping the Yemenis address the core issues that drive the conflict, and that we're not really going to be able to move beyond these very basic agreements under current circumstances. And I think, in this case, I would take issue with many people who argue that really what we need to do is to really expand the aperture of the negotiations and bring in Southerners and bring in civil society and begin to address issues of women and youth. I think that if you do that now or prematurely, it could risk derailing even our ability to achieve our basic, fundamental goals and objectives for the moment. Just to build on Daniel's comment about, did the war start 5 years ago? Did it start 15 years ago? I would say that he's far too optimistic. In my view, the war started about 60 years ago, and really started in the inability of the North or South Yemen to address the fundamental challenges of the society, going back to the Republican overthrow of the Imamate and the civil war that raged for 8 years from 1962 to 1970. Or in the South, of course, the revolt against the British and the establishment of the PDRY. And so the issue is that we've never actually seen in Yemen an ability to address the structural defects that have brought the country to these, kind of sporadic explosions of violence and conflict. And that's not because there haven't been a number of efforts to address them. The fact of the matter is that you had a unity accord in 1990 that was supposed to lay out the parameters of the unification of North and South Yemen. That was followed by a document called the Document of Pledge and Accord that was supposed to stop the Civil War in 1994. You had a number of mediated efforts to end conflict between the Houthis and the government in the Sada Wars, 6 Sada Wars from 2004 to 2010. You had the GCC Initiative and Transition Mechanism in 2011, which included yet another round of dialogue called the National Dialogue Conference, which ran from 2013 to 2014. And then the last agreement was the Peace and National Partnership Agreement that was signed between the Houthis and the government in September of 2014. So there have been historically a number of efforts on the part of Yemenis to come together and figure out how to move forward and how to address these issues and to prevent continued conflict. If we were to try to do another round of negotiations, of dialogue, of addressing these broad endemic problems, my anticipation would be that the result would be the same. Often, these agreements were only prelude to a new round of fighting, and I would fear that the same thing would be the case now. And the fundamental issues that confront Yemen are the issues of political disenfranchisement, economic marginalization, and sectional rivalries. And we've never overcome that. So Yemen, in this sense, is a classic failed state as defined by Asamoah and Robinson in their book, Why Nations Fail, who define it as, characterized by the concentration of political and economic power in the hands of a narrow elite with few constraints placed on their exercise of power. And this is the fundamental issue that challenges Yemen and that they've never been able to overcome. So, in my view, we talk about Yemen as, possibly a proxy war. It's not a proxy war. It's not a sectarian war, even though the Houthis are Zaidi, even though the government, the Houthi government, is Shafi'i. The fact of the matter is that these political and economic elites don't break down along sectarian lines, and the fact is that the Houthis, in their 6 Sada wars, and even this, which I characterize as the 7th Sada war, don't necessarily only appeal to Zaidi populations. Their ability to expand their influence to the northern part of the country rested also on the attractiveness of their program and of their policies to many disenfranchised, marginalized Sunnis as well. And so that's, you can't look at this only, in a Shia Sunni or Iran or Saudi Arabia context. It's much broader than that, and I agree with Daniel that even if you got the Saudis and the Iranians out, it would not mean an end to the conflict in Yemen. So, again, it's not, the other point, of course, is that this continued conflict and the inability of Yemenis to address their differences isn't for lack of trying. They have repeatedly tried to come to the table and work together to identify what their problems are and to come to agreements on how to do them. And the other reality is that these agreements are all very similar. They all identify the same problems. They all come up with similar solutions. So whether you're talking about increased local autonomy, federalism, a better economic break, different formulas for ensuring that the sections have a greater political role in governing the country. All of those things have been agreed to before in previous negotiations. What you don't have is the structural capacity of the society to actually implement the agreements that are being made, because you have an elite in Yemen that has no particular interest in surrendering any of its economic or political power, and you don't have the kind of institutional capacity that would allow the government or the society to force those changes. So until you get that, you're really not going to see progress. I would point out, again, in the terms of agreements, you had in the National Dialogue Conference over 500 people, fairly representative of the country as a whole, sitting for more than a year, who came up with 1,600 different recommendations on how to move beyond the conflict, how to begin to build a more stable, unified Yemen. Maybe some of those recommendations were lousy. I'm sure that they were. But many of them were probably good. So before you do anything else, before you wade into another round of negotiations, I think that it's worthwhile to have people take a look back at what has already been agreed and talk about how to implement existing agreements rather than try to forge a new one. And then a few final points. The U.S. and the humanitarian and the international community have to play a role in achieving this, because it's not going to happen just on the basis of the Yemeni effort themselves. We can help. USAID obviously has to play a big role. Others do as well. But we also have to go into it with our eyes open and recognize that this is not something that's going to be achieved very quickly. It's going to be time-consuming. It's going to be expensive. And the ultimate outcome is certainly not assured. And then the other point, and one of the things that concerns me, there is, and Daniel was, perfectly legitimate on his analysis of the Saudi-Iranian issue. One of the things that concerns me about where we are right now in this town and in the West, and the complete obsession with looking at Yemen through the context of Saudi Arabia, of Saudi sins of omission and commission, of now, the Saudi Arabia that is the Khashoggi murderer, et cetera, et cetera. One is that we conflate Yemen and Jamal Khashoggi, which I think is a mistake. The other thing is that it fails to recognize, and here I will take a little bit of issue. Iran is not responding to Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is responding to Iran's intervention in Yemen. And I think that it's unhelpful not to recognize the reality that the Iranians began to increase their support to the Houthis in 2012. We caught them red-handed, and anyone who doubts that can just look up Jihad 1 on your Google, and you will see that the Iranians were beginning to supply military equipment to the Houthis at a time where the political transition that was negotiated by the Yemenis, the GCC initiative, was absolutely in train. And the Houthis were sitting at the negotiating table along with everybody else. And yet the Iranians were beginning to provide them arms. IRGC personnel were in Yemen, we know that for a fact. Hezbollah was coming to Yemen, we know that for a fact. So all of these things were going on from very early on in the political transition that had absolutely nothing to do with Saudi Arabia or Saudi intervention in Yemen. And that the Iranian engagement began to accelerate and expand in the fall of 2014, when the Houthis basically seized control of Sana'a and established civil air agreements with Iran. There was a direct Tehran-Sana'a flight on a daily basis that was bringing in materiel, that was bringing in all kinds of people. And the Houthis began making threatening noises about the Saudi border and about their intention to carry their conflict into Saudi Arabia. So all of these things were going on. Now we may say, well, it was rhetoric, maybe it wasn't that significant, maybe Saudi Arabia wasn't really threatened, but I can say that that wasn't at all how the Saudis perceived it, and whether we agree with them or don't agree with them about the nature of the threat, I do believe that that their concerns and their expressions of worry were completely legitimate. Not to defend the way the Saudis have conducted the war. I agree with all of the criticism that has been leveled at them, but the fact of the matter is that as a reflection of a legitimate concern about the security of their southern border, I think that the Saudis were fundamentally correct. I would say a couple of other things. I think the issue of the UAE is an interesting one, and something that we should discuss more broadly, because because I think that the Saudis have been relatively clear about what it is that their aims and objectives are in Yemen. I think that they want a friendly government in Sana'a. They want a secure southern border, and they want to know that there are not IRGC or Hezbollah operatives around in the country. All, in my view, things that we should be supporting. The Emiratis, who initially went into Yemen in order to demonstrate support for their regional ally, I think have expanded their goals and objectives in the region. And it's not entirely clear to me where the Emiratis are, but I think that the Emiratis see Yemen not in its own context, but as a stepping stone to their broader goals of establishing a very strong regional ambition in the Red Sea littoral, in the Horn of Africa, and up and down the Red Sea coast, up to the Suez Canal. And so, and I'm not sure that that either we or the Saudis necessarily would buy into that Emirati vision. A couple of other things. Houthis are relatively effective fighters, yes, absolutely. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that their initial successes in 2014, 2015 also depended heavily on the fact that large elements of the Yemeni military, including the Republican Guard, which was by far the best equipped, best trained units in the Yemeni military, defected and were supporting the Houthis. And what you've seen in that period since fall of 2014 until now is the ability of the Houthis to basically co-opt many of those more experienced, better trained, better equipped military forces into their own fighting force. So an awful lot of their initial successes, although I agree with the fact that they were pretty decent after their 6 years of experience in the Sada wars, nevertheless was the result of Ali Abdullah Saleh's decision to align himself with them. And then the last point that I would make on Daniel's comments was his assertion that AQAP governance was reasonably effective. I can tell you, when I was there in 2012, when AQAP occupied large swaths of Abiyan governorate and declared their caliphate, what happened? Well, frankly, Zanzibar, which was the capital of Abiyan and the largest city, essentially became a ghost town. Everybody fled from Zanzibar. Al-Qaeda did absolutely nothing to govern. They were executing people in the soccer stadium. They were doing all kinds of things. They were pretty effective in basically booby-trapping every building in Zanzibar, but really not doing very much beyond that. And when they tried to expand their influence in Abiyan to Jar, the second city in Abiyan, basically the people rose up and revolted, and that was what began the chain reaction that eventually led to their being pushed out. So I'm not aware of any instance where AQ has actually ever established effective governance anywhere in Yemen, which isn't to say that anybody else has either. So let me stop there.
Okay. Well, two very thorough and very interesting presentations. Dan, you'll get a chance to respond throughout the course of the morning and afternoon, but let me now identify people who'd like to ask questions, and I will try to make the list as Paul, Mike Bloomfield, lady back there. Okay, well, we got at least five, and I'll go adding as I see. Well, first, could you bring the microphone here to Paul Pilar, who I don't think needs any introduction, but.
Yeah, thanks for two excellent presentations. I want to ask Ambassador Feierstein about your comments. There were basically an argument that the Saudis were justified about being afraid of the Iranians. And regardless of whatever was the exact sequence of this amount of aid or that amount of aid, and of course the total amount doesn't hold a candle, obviously, to the ordinance that the Saudis have dropped. But it really goes back to a point Dan made, and that is the Iranians, whatever is the scale of their effort, have not been able to purchase a puppet. And reportedly, tell me if I'm wrong about this or you have a different perception, when it came to the most important decision in the war the Houthis made, which was the capture of Sana'a, this was not on Iranian advice, it was contrary to Iranian advice. So, I mean, how can you say that it really is a fully justified Iranian fear, or Saudi fear? There's no question that the Iranians want to put fearsome thoughts in the minds of the Saudis, but it's not a matter of an Iranian beachhead, but rather what they're going against are the Houthis and all their local grievances.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I absolutely agree, and I have never gone along with the thinking that this is a proxy war, or that the Houthis were some wholly owned subsidiaries of Iran. But there's a difference between being a puppet and being willing to allow another government to take advantage of a favorable circumstance in order to establish itself. So no, the Houthis have their own minds. Although I'll tell you, interestingly, I was talking to a Yemeni friend who maintains contacts with both sides on this issue a couple months ago, and he insisted that the reason, well, let me go back. What his argument was is that when the Iranians agreed to provide the Houthis with the ballistic missile capability to strike into Saudi Arabia, the deal that they struck with the Houthis was that they would provide this capacity, in exchange for which the Houthis would agree not to agree to anything without Iranian concurrence. And that the decision that the Houthis made in September not to go to Geneva was because they were told by the Iranians not to go. Now, that may or may not be the case. But while I agree that the Houthis are not a puppet, I would say that it would be incorrect to say that the Houthis are completely independent of Iranian influence, or that left to their own devices, they would not allow Iran to establish a beachhead in the Arabian Peninsula that would be threatening to Saudi Arabia.
Dan, you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I think there's a broader problem with the Saudi standard, which is if their standard is there should be no Iranian influence on their borders, then they should move their country to another part of the world, right? I mean, that's just completely unrealistic. And this is something we saw the United States do a decade ago in Iraq, which was to say we don't want Iran to have any influence, right? And that was completely absurd given geography, cultural connections, and so on, and given the fact that the U.S. presence there led some groups to turn to Iran. And the Saudi intervention took, in my view, a relatively minor, opportunistic, low-level Iranian connection and made the Houthis much more dependent on it, right? The Houthis had to wage war at a much more massive level, and you need outside support to some degree for that. And to me, a failure of American diplomacy with Saudi Arabia under the Obama administration and a continued failure under the Trump administration was one of the great U.S. historic strengths is not getting our allies to do stuff. It's actually getting our allies to refrain from doing stupid stuff, right? And this would have been a great example where I knew no military analyst in the Pentagon, in the intelligence community, or elsewhere in 2015 who thought this war was going to go well, right? I don't know anyone who said, boy, the Saudi Air Force and the Saudis in general are really going to handle this well. This will remove Iranian influence and really send a message. Right, and we were very reluctant in 2015 for reasons. I have my own views. The ambassador, I'm sure, knows better than I, and we're even more so today. And to me, that's what we need to be thinking of: is trying to stop our allies from self-defeating behavior.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Lake Bloomfield, the next.
Thank you. Well, thank you both for very interesting presentations. I think it's timely for Washington to be hearing more, not less, about this conflict. I want to continue Paul's point on Iran, but look forward. The Congress is contemplating legislation that could cut off precision-guided munitions, could clearly impact the Royal Saudi Air Force's ability to continue in Yemen. The negotiations are going on in Stockholm. I want to ask you this question. Daniel, I'm going to quote your line. You said, "This war is almost an Iranian dream." And I take your point. My question is, if the Congress were to cut off precision-guided munitions and really impair the ability of the Saudis to continue, would that be more or less of an Iranian dream? I'd be curious on your view on both of you.
If the congressional decision leads to a rupture in U.S.-Saudi relations, that would be wonderful for Iran. If it leads Saudi Arabia to continue the war even less effectively, which is quite an accomplishment, but nevertheless possible, that would be beneficial for Iran. But there will be an immediate cost to the Saudi reputation and a benefit to the Iranians if the Saudis cut their intervention. right? They will be walking away from Yemen defeated effectively, or at least not victorious. But 2 years from now, the Saudis will have put this behind them. While every day this is a defeat in world opinion and in spending resources for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This is self-defeating, right? And so I do think there is a cost. I think there will be a short-term cost to the kingdom vis-a-vis Iran, but I think it's definitely worth paying in the long term.
Yeah. I think, and the debate's gone back, and I was still in the government when we had the debate in the Obama administration about cutting off PGMs. First, there was a decision to cut off the cluster munitions, and I think everybody was okay with that on the basis that this conflict really didn't justify the use of cluster munitions, so therefore why sell something that, from our perspective, was the wrong weapon to use. The PGM debate was hotter, and it went back to this point of what, does cutting off PGMs mean that the Saudis would be relying more on dumb bombs than on PGMs, and does that actually mean that at the end of the day you would have higher civilian casualties, not reduced civilian casualties, and that was the argument. And at the time as of the time that I left, the argument, the position of the Obama administration was to continue with the PGMs, which they eventually reversed towards the end of the administration. Did cut off the PGM sale, didn't change the Saudi war plan, and then of course Trump came in and reversed the Obama decision. So the fundamental point, and it kind of goes back to this: whether we agree with the Saudis or disagree with the Saudis about whether they are justified in feeling that the situation in Yemen existentially threatens their security. And it's not a question of what we think, it's a question of what they think. And if you believe that that's their view, they're going to continue the war whether we sell PGMs or we don't sell PGMs. They're not going to stop doing it. And I've always been curious about people who believe that we could, get countries to do something or not to do something based on our druthers when it's absolutely, in that country's perception, not in their interest to do it. And I would say that that's the case here with Saudi Arabia. As long as they believe that they need to fight the fight in Yemen, they're going to continue doing it, whether we sell them PGMs or not. And therefore, I think that we should look at it in terms of is it more effective? I wouldn't say that we shouldn't examine it also in the context of our own reputation and our own sense of what's right and wrong. And if we believe that it's wrong, as the Obama administration did in late 2016, then we should stop. But stopping it with the expectation that we're going to change Saudi Arabia's behavior inside of Yemen, I think would be foolhardy on our part. And the last point that I'll make is, and it goes back, it's a little bit of a tangent, but look, we have a vested interest. We all have a vested interest. If you're at all interested in seeing Yemen stabilized and unified and able to move forward, we have an interest in making sure that at the end of the day, the Saudis believe that they got an outcome that is acceptable to them. Why is that? Well, I can tell you why. There are billions and billions of dollars of damage that have been inflicted on that country over the last 4 years. There is a huge need to try to get some economic activity going in that country in order to allow people in Yemen to provide for themselves and to build decent futures for themselves. Who's going to cover that? Is the United States going to cover that? Absolutely not. Is Western Europe going to cover that? No way. Are the Iranians going to pay? No. So who's going to pay the bill that's going to come due in Yemen at the end of this conflict? It's going to be the Saudis and the Emiratis. Nobody else is going to come up with the funds. And if they believe that they have been forced by the United States to walk away from a conflict where they feel that their security is threatened, they're not going to come forward. They're not going to pay that bill. They'll say, over to you, this is your problem. And then we're going to be in a big mess, and the Yemenis are going to be in a bigger mess.
So, the lady, yes, could you just?
Hi, Tracy Wilkinson from the Los Angeles Times. Actually, that was my question. It almost seems like congressional action is in a vacuum. You know, after hearing the two of you, it seems so irrelevant. But maybe I could ask, the ambassadors, I think, said that the conflation of the Khashoggi murder with Yemen was a mistake, was wrong. If you could elaborate on that. And also, there were some who say that at least it attracted attention to the cause, and that alone is worthwhile. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, just very simply, look, I have no interest in Mohammed bin Salman. And I can say that, you know, concerns about his mental state go all the way back to the very beginning. Again, when I was still in government, people were scratching their heads a little bit, wondering about where this guy is going. People gave him the benefit of the doubt. I think that for a variety of reasons, of which Jamal Khashoggi is only the latest and maybe the most outrageous. You know, I think that people have made up their minds about him, and that's fine. And if the Congress wants to demand that he be sanctioned, I have no concern about that. If they want to say that the guy is never welcome in the United States again, fine, whatever. But the reasons that there is a conflict in Yemen don't have anything to do with Jamal Khashoggi or Mohammed bin Salman. And I think, and I'll put words in Daniel's mouth, I think that we agree on this, that the fundamental issues in Yemen are internal to Yemen, and that we should not be projecting our anger and frustration about Mohammed bin Salman onto a conflict that was not related to him, where, you know, it leads us to make false conclusions about what is the nature of the war and how best to move forward beyond the war.
Dan?
So I agree certainly that the war in Yemen, its origins and much of its nature today has nothing to do with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. But there's a big however in my thinking. This is a leader that has shown a destructive impulsiveness in a variety of ways. So a very brief moment, some of you may recall, was the kidnapping of the Prime Minister of Lebanon, right? And so this is a kingdom that is a tremendously important player, that is a force of instability in a region that has enough instability. And the murder of a dissident is one example, but the Yemen war is another example where they are making this worse. And although I don't think there is a cause and effect in any way between these two issues, it highlights the erratic and impulsive and dangerous foreign policy and actions of a kingdom. And we can't bring Khashoggi back to life, right? But we can do some things to try to reduce the scope and scale of violence in Yemen. And in response to a question, I do actually think congressional action is tremendously relevant, right? And here's where I think the ambassador and I may disagree on an important issue. I think we focus exclusively on munitions, then the war can continue. But the Saudi Air Force depends in a dozen ways, big and small, on U.S. support. And this is intelligence, this is logistics, this is refueling, this is maintenance, this is spare parts, this is a host of different issues. And again, we've designed it in part to do that, right? That's not completely an accident on our part either. And we have tremendous ability to shape the Saudi Air Force's conduct in this war. It may be a mistake to use it. I personally think we should use that influence, but I think there are legitimate reasons to disagree. But congressional action can shape our response to Saudi Arabia in important ways, and I think it's very valuable.
Okay, so, sorry, Ted, let me have you. Now, on my list so far, I have the gentleman here is next, then gentleman here, then Paul and Ted Katouth. Who am I missing? Oh, Jenny Abdu. Anyone else?
Put me on there, Jeff.
Peter? Gil. Okay. Well, that's the.
You can cross me off, Jeff, because Dane answered my question.
Drop you off? My God.
He answered my question.
Okay, so, yes, sir.
Sure. Ishan Tharoor with the Washington Post. Just a couple of quick questions. I know, I think the point is well taken that the conversation about Yemen in Washington, and particularly in Congress, operates in a different theater than our conversation about what's actually happening in Yemen. But as some have suggested in the city, has this sort of opposition in Congress, do you think it shadows any of the deliberations in Stockholm? And in terms of the leverage that certain parties have, does sort of the conflict over Yemen within Washington impact those talks? Secondly, the Saudis and Emiratis make a lot of noise about how much aid and humanitarian assistance they are giving themselves currently. International organizations retort that it'd be much better if you just stop blockading and bombing Yemen instead of these efforts. What do you where do you fit in? Where do you sort of sit in this debate? And then lastly, Ambassador Feierstein, I think last time we talked at another panel, you suggested, or at least you echoed, thinking there at the time that it would be good if the Saudis and Emiratis can take Hudaydah to change the kind of battlefield landscape. Do you still think that now, a couple of weeks later?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all.
Well,
Would you want to do the first question and you the second?
Sure. Well, certainly on the negotiations, I would defer to the ambassador.
All right.
So if you want to begin.
on the negotiations, I would say, I don't know. It's interesting, and I have been a little bit concerned that if the Houthis happen to read the Washington Post, and I don't know if they do, you probably can check with your subscription people. If they were to read the Washington Post, they might well conclude that they don't need to negotiate seriously because Washington is going to deliver the Saudis for them. So that would be the worst case, kind of situation. But fundamentally, I don't think that we've seen any particular reflection of that in the conversations in Stockholm. And probably the more compelling decision for the Houthis is whether or not they believe that they can get more out of a negotiating process than they can get out of the continuation of the conflict. And that's always been, I think, the basic decision that's going to have to be made, is when do the parties come to the conclusion that they have gone as far as they're going to go on the military side, and the time has come to return to the negotiating table and try to see what they can get out of that. On Hodeidah, I believed, and remember, we actually kind of launched the proposal a year or so ago of getting a negotiated resolution of the Hodeidah issue to allow a third party to come in and manage the port, and that, which is fundamentally the strategy that Martin Griffiths has been pursuing really since the summer. And the notion is that the Emiratis primarily would put pressure on the Houthis militarily to kind of demonstrate to them that they would lose the port one way or the other, and that therefore it was in everybody's interest to kind of come to an arrangement that would allow a peaceful transition. And that still seems to be the strategy going forward, and I still think that it's right.
Anything to add, Dan?
Yeah, because Hodeidah is such an important port, that for those of you who have been following the UAE-led military operation, it's destroying the port, right? I mean, it's not a surgical operation that cuts off the cities and destroys the fighters and leaves the infrastructure intact. And so, again, what I want to stress is that the humanitarian catastrophe is ongoing, right? It's not imminent, it's not around the corner, it's ongoing. So when you disrupt the major port in a massive way for a sustained period of time, we're talking probably hundreds of thousands of innocent deaths. Right now, it's not directly from war, it's from the second, third order effects. And the operation has been much slower than people hoped for. My personal hope on that operation was the UAE and the Saudis would gain a limited success, they would declare victory, and they could leave or reduce their role with their heads held high, right? They could say, having achieved our goal, move on. Having put in a UN presence to ensure that Iranian goods are not smuggled through the port, we can leave, right? They would be able to have a facing way, but they don't seem to be moving in that direction, and it's deeply distressing. And the blockade combined with the destruction of the infrastructure is devastating to this country. And this is getting worse and worse. And part of the problem is we only have limited reporting. I can't stress that enough, is we are only seeing part of this picture. There are large parts of the country that are not particularly accessible or monitored. And that should be deeply upsetting to all of us.
And therefore, there's no television coverage of this. That's what it seems to me one of the huge problems. We just don't see what's going on.
I would just add, and again, I mean, we've had a couple of questions related to the blockade and the impact of the blockade on humanitarian relief supplies, but the blockade is not the sole reason that relief supplies have difficulty reaching many of the people who are in need. And you also have to look at the checkpoints, the bribery and the other kinds of things. The reporting that we've seen recently of the many tons of food supplies that are sitting in warehouses in no data because the Houthis haven't allowed them to be shipped. The siege of Taz. I mean, so only talking about the blockade is again, I think, a misleading way of understanding the nature of the situation in Yemen.
So,
Hi, I'm Bruce Abrams with USA, Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Middle East Bureau. And thank you today. This is really interesting and really kind of feeds our own knowledge of Yemen on the ground and based on your experience. One quick comment and a question. So I just wanted to, Ambassador, reiterate the importance of what you said in terms of standing up Yemen's economy in terms of not only addressing long-term stability, but the humanitarian situation, in that we've also heard that to a certain extent there is food on the shelves, but it's the lack of purchasing power and just the balkanization of the banking system. So we've actually heard that in the peace talks in Sweden, the economy is for the first time part of those talks. And in fact, not that we're going to get there, but the goal of unification of the banking system, unification of the Ministry of Finance with the banking system to address salary payments, stabilizing the currency, trade facilitation is potentially part of the agreement, and that, we feel that's very important. In terms of my question, in your comments you counsel against right now broadening the dialogue to include women, youth, other groups, maybe the Southern Transitional Council. Understood that, yet later in your comments you pointed out, which I think is right as well, that peace in Yemen can only come from breaking the chokehold that the elites have on the economy and the political system. So at what point do you broaden, if not the peace talks, at what point do you bring those other groups in to try to break that chokehold? And in a related question, what do you see as a path for governance in Yemen in terms of the level of decentralization, regionalization, a federalist Yemen, a unified Yemen? Where might be that sweet spot, that needle to thread? Thank you very much.
A brief answer, if you could, because I have 5 more people and they're running out of time.
Very briefly, I think that you do need to go back and take a look at some of the agreements that have already been achieved. I agree that for Yemen, given the very fractured nature of that society, that you do need to move decision-making down to much lower levels. I agreed with the decision of the National Dialogue Conference to establish a federal system, understanding that Houthi kind of screwed up the implementation which didn't help, but I think that fundamentally it was the right decision. But I think that, I think that what you need to do is to go back and look at some of the work that's been done, and decide what it is that people want and don't want. And the other part is, I think, we need to complete the transitional mechanism that was underway in 2014 until the Houthis broke it, and complete that process and allow the Yemeni people to go back and elect representatives who can actually legitimately speak for them, and then take up some of these issues. And then the other part of it, of course, is institutional capacity building, which I think is absolutely essential.
Okay, I have Ted Katouth, Jenny Abdu, Peter Rosenblatt, Gil Balmer. That's it. That's the list. So, Ted.
Okay, I'm going to ask a somewhat perhaps naive question, but it occurs to me while all of this is going on, and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and even the U.S. are spending billions of dollars on this war, and the Yemenis, 25, 28 million people, I don't know how many Yemenis there are having untold suffering. It's as though a tsunami is out there that could, eventually that's going to break on shore. And you mentioned that tsunami. It's no water. It's, here in one of the poorest countries on earth, they're running out of water, including in the capital city. And you said that, I'll try to make this one more quick. You said Saudi Arabia and the UAE were the only ones who had the wherewithal and the motives to try to rebuild some of what's been destroyed. Well, I don't think the trust level is high with those two countries in a lot of quarters in Yemen. But wonder if the international community, spearheaded by Saudi and UAE money, but with others contributing as well, let the Yemeni people know, look, you're facing these existential problems, even if the war could end it tomorrow. We're prepared to step in and help with some of these existential issues, such as water and your distribution network and all, with a huge aid package, but you have to get these various factions to sit down and hammer out a federal system, maybe along the lines that Ariani and that group, I don't know what they were called, National Reconciliation Group, whatever, putting it.
Yeah, just very quickly, the water issue in Yemen is on the plateau, including Sana'a, which is rapidly depleting whatever water is left. I think that the only solution, and I was talking about this in 2010 before all of this started, is really to figure out how to move the population out of Sana'a. The reason people go to Sana'a is because that's the only place in the country that had economic activity. And therefore, you need to figure out how to promote economic activity in other places in the country, like the Tahama, which don't have the same issues with water that the capital has. But it's going to require desal, and I don't know of any government, certainly again not the United States government, that's going to pay for desalination plants in Yemen. So again, I come back to the basic point. Yes, you need an entirely different way of looking at the socioeconomic situation in the country, get population to where the water is with economic activity, and then somebody's going to have to figure out how to pay for it all.
And don't you see the horrible parallels here, except with the water problem probably, with Syria? I mean, billions and billions of dollars needed, but there's no way the Iranians or the Russians are going to pick up the bill. And there's a lot of bills lying around the Middle East right now. Jenny Abdu.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. And thank you for your presentations. They were very interesting and substantive. I just have a broad question, which is I'm very interested in how each of you sort of see the U.S.-Saudi relationship going forward. And based upon what seems to be, a likely scenario. I mean, the Crown Prince isn't going to be passed over. At least there's no sign of that at this point within the kingdom. As I think you both agree, the war will continue whether we sell them arms or not. They'll just buy them elsewhere. So in a sense, we're sort of, we're seriously damaging a relationship with somewhat of an ally in the region that will we're not gonna change the Saudi kingdom's behavior. I mean, I guess I don't really see that happening. So how do you see the relationship going forward, given, what seems to be sort of some basic facts that we know now? Thank you.
Either of you.
I'll start. I think we both have a lot to say. So I actually think we can change their behavior, right? We enable their military intervention, right? I mean, I can't stress this enough about the Air Force. This is a technical issue, right? That won't mean that they'll still have an adventurous foreign policy. We're not going to change that. But some of the worst of the worst right now in Yemen, we can affect, right? We can have a direct impact over. What I would say more broadly, though, is this relationship, which has spanned decades and political parties, is becoming much more politicized in Washington. We're going to see a Democratic House, and it will continue to criticize Saudi Arabia in part because it deserves it, and in part because Saudi Arabia is a wonderful country to criticize for political reasons. Right? So there'll be a political imperative along with some legitimate foreign policy disagreements. And I think we're likely to see that dynamic become quite pronounced, whether it goes into a new administration that would be a Democratic administration in 2 years or 6 years or whatever, I don't know. But I think the political dynamic is going to be nastier in the United States.
Okay.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that. I think that the basic principle is that the U.S.-Saudi relationship over the past 60 plus years, 70 plus years, has been mutually beneficial, and I think that there is reason for us to want to try to preserve that. The issue is not Saudi Arabia. The issue is Mohammed bin Salman. And the question is, how do we identify what are the core elements of our relationship with Saudi Arabia that we want to preserve, while basically taking a look at how we deal with the Saudi leadership. And I think that one of the things, and again, I've said this before, I think one of the things is that we need an ambassador on the ground in Riyadh who can talk to people, and that we're not dependent on a Jared Kushner, Mohammed bin Salman phone call to try to figure out what our policy is with that country. I think that we need a more realistic assessment of what are the true elements of the relationship that we want to preserve, and what are the parts that perhaps we can do without, and they'll be doing the same thing. But at the end of the day, I think that we need to figure out how to go forward working with this country, which has been a good partner for many years, and upon whom we continue to have an important relationship. As long as we're interested in global economic security, Saudi Arabia is going to be important. As long as we believe in the fundamental elements of regional stability, Saudi Arabia is going to be important, and we got to figure out how to keep that going.
Thank you. Peter Rosenblatt?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. Going back to fundamentals, setting aside the interests of outside powers, what are the basic issues dividing the Houthis from other Yemenis and vice versa?
Well, again, I would say, you had the 6 Sada wars. The Houthis actually expanded their influence and their reach through all of those 6 wars by expanding beyond. And again, this isn't an issue of the Zaydis versus the Shafi'i. This is an issue really of economic marginalization and political disenfranchisement, and the ability of the Houthis to capitalize on that and to really put forward a program that appealed to many Yemenis across the board, including tribal elements and including people in the urban areas, and so I think that they were reasonably successful in establishing kind of a populist political platform that many people found attractive. Now they have lost a lot of legitimacy and credibility, I think, with many Yemeni people, including many of the people in Sana'a, over the last 4 years, and the way they've managed affairs, the way they've managed issues. They've created a lot more enemies, I think, than they have friends. But nevertheless, they did speak to a part of the Yemeni population that felt that nobody else was speaking for them.
anything to add to that?
The other grievance the Houthis will mention is there's been an increase in the last 20 years in largely Saudi-funded proselytization in Yemen that's been explicitly demonizing kind of Zaidi Shiism. And that's been a grievance that has been growing on their side. But I agree with the ambassador. It's primarily about patronage and their share of the spoils. And they've been able to articulate a vision claiming that their community and those they represent have not gotten enough. But what I would stress to everyone is the war itself creates new dynamics. And now you have warlords, you have local leaders, you have a lot of players who were not there when this conflict began. And so solving the initial issues that began this is not the end, it's simply the beginning.
So, Gil, you have the last question, but not the last word.
Gil Barndola here at the center. You both spoke briefly about AQAP and jihadis in Yemen more broadly. Can you speak about the extent to which the coalition has both fought and empowered jihadi groups and how the Saudis and the Emiratis have differed in their approach?
So I'll begin by saying where the ambassador and I disagreed on the effectiveness of AQAP governance. The period I was referring to is not the 2011-2012 period, where I agree it was disastrous. It was actually the 2015-2016 period, where they explicitly learned their lessons and tried to govern much more with locals, right? And we have kind of lessons learned studies which are somewhat akin to what the U.S. military has done about how they want to do better in governance. This has been the jihadists initially were able to exploit the collapse of the Yemeni state. They were seen as they were anti-Houthi in part because of the sectarian difference, in part because of proselytization, and they were supported as pushing back. Then the U.S. was understandably complaining about this, so our allies, especially the UAE, took the lead in kind of going after this, but as I mentioned, also co-opting this. Right, so it wasn't again the U.S. solution. It was a different solution, somewhat effective in my view, but nevertheless different. But when you have a weak state, you're going to have the ability of a range of negative actors to have some degree of operational freedom. And so it's a relative question. The good news is not only have they had military problems, not only have they lost territory and lost that mini haven they enjoyed for a while, but they're also split. You have a very serious divide with an Islamic State splinter that's consumed a lot of the energy of this group. And the good news from an American point of view is the vast majority of their energy is local. And so, although there were, I think, appropriate concerns given the 2009, 2010 attacks they were doing outside and beyond the United States, I think the energy and the danger is much more local.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with Daniel on this, and I think that this is an area where we need to be extremely cautious about the way we go forward. What I would say is that Yemenis, being Yemeni, are going to look to any quarter for alliances, for assistance when they see the need. And anyone who comes to a Yemeni and says, I will give you money or I will give you weapons, is probably going to be seen as a friend. And AQAP has been very effective at that, which is basically coloring themselves as supporters of local groups that have their own specific grievances and their own specific agendas. And people will sign on, and people may even fly the black flag and do those things. But the important thing is that ideologically, they are not AQ. And they're not believers in global jihad, and they're not going to fly airplanes into the World Trade Center. And I think that it's important for us, and here I worry a little bit about where the Emiratis are going, because I'm not sure that they're as careful as they need to be about this. It's important for us to recognize that for many of the people in these communities, in these villages in Yemen, this is a practical solution to an immediate problem, and not a question of joining AQ. And we're going to need those people eventually when we get back into the business of pursuing counterterrorism objectives ourselves, because they're the people who are going to help us identify who the really bad guys are. And if we start killing them, then we're going to create the kind of backlash that we want to avoid.
Thank you both very, very much to terrific presentations, and thank you all for coming. I don't think we've heard the last word on Yemen. Thank you very much.